Hey, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everyone, wherever you're calling in from. My name is Paul Colby. I'm director of the Intelligence Project at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. It gives me great pleasure today to facilitate a discussion with old friend, old colleague, Beth Sanner, who had a storied career as a senior analyst at CIA, covered many parts of the globe, Southeast Asia, South Asia, Balkans, Europe, served as on the National Security Council, and her career culminated in a fascinating assignment as the PDDNI, the Principal Deputy Director of National Intelligence for Mission Integration, where she was responsible for the IC's intelligence output, the finished products, and she was also overseeing and participating in delivery of the president's daily brief. She's a fantastic officer now in the private sector, doing lots of different things, and we're delighted to have her as a senior fellow at the Belfer Center. And she spent a day talking with students and others today. So we wanted to take advantage of Beth being here and look ahead into 2023. So 2020, 2021, 2022, tumultuous, surprising years in so many different ways. And lots of folks now, many companies, many think tanks are doing their look ahead. What's going to happen in 2023? And so we wanted to think about how do you think about thinking ahead? How does the intelligence community plan for surprise, challenge assumptions, prepare policymakers for the things they should be thinking about and maybe the things they aren't thinking about? So before we kick off into that discussion, let me turn over the mic to Maria Robson-Morrow, who will provide some ground rules for today's discussion. Maria, over to you.
Thank you so much, Paul, and thank you to all of you for being here. We're delighted to have nearly 100 people on the call and counting for our last webinar of the calendar year. So before we begin, we do have a few administrative notes. The first is that while this virtual event is on the record, the Belfer Center prohibits any attendees, including journalists, from audio or visual recording or distributing parts or all of the programming without written authorization. Secondly, your cameras and microphones have been muted for the session, but we ask you and encourage you to use the Q&A box, and we will address as many questions as time allows. With that, I will turn it back over to Paul to kick off the discussion.
Great. Thank you, Maria. So Beth, let's just start off at the general, and then we'll end up diving down into specifics, and I'm sure different geographies and issues that face us in 2023. But let's take a look a little bit about, I'm interested in your views and thoughts on how does the IC, how does the CIA and others think about surprise, think about expectations, think about black swans as they look into the future, and how does that fit in with how they prepare policymakers for that?
Well, I think that it's a huge challenge for analysts who are what we call on the line. So your analysts who are day to day following a particular area to be the people who are thinking outside the box. A long time ago, I think it was under maybe John McLaughlin when he was head of analysis, they established at CIA a red cell. And, this was an organization and still exists as far as I know, to challenge conventional thinking, to say, like, how could this be different than what the conventional wisdom is? And the National Intelligence Council has a group that focuses on alternative futures and futures look. That's the group that does the Global Futures Project every 4 years and develops an unclassified briefing paper, very long project over more than a year to try to figure out, what does it look like 20 years from now or 30 years from now? What could the world look like? And I think, the real challenge for the intelligence community is how do you challenge analysts who are working day to day to think about how things could be different. And, to me, the one of the main ways of doing that are having managers, analytic managers, ask questions. And, the most important one is, how could we be wrong? To lay out the assumptions to challenge those, to have conversations about how we could be wrong. And I think the second most important thing is to bring people in from other areas of the organization, from other topics, to challenge and areas that are particularly important where we have high stakes, to challenge those assumptions, and for analysts to be open to having a conversation about that. Because, you know, we've all heard about the research or read the research about the paradox of expertise, which means that the closer we are to a topic, the less likely we are to be able to see potential change and deltas. And so we have to build into the system some way of having other people. And it's another reason why right now I'm working on a project with the University of Maryland on behalf of the government on crowdsourced forecasting, because it's a way of having outsiders provide a perspective. It doesn't matter whether it's right or wrong, but it's putting into the system some challenge mechanisms. Oops, you're on mute.
Part of the popular conception of the intelligence community is that its role is to predict, to forecast, to soothsay, to lay odds, and often, if that prediction either wasn't made, or if it turns off to be off, either in time or in nature, then it's labeled an intelligence failure. Right. So we were talking before this, just before the discussion, about how what was an incredible, in my view, intelligent success in using intelligence, not only collecting and analyzing intelligence, which identified Russia's intentions and capability to invade Ukraine, but that it was used preemptively to help prepare Ukraine, prepare our allies for what was to come, and to try to deter that conflict. But then that quickly became, the narrative quickly became described as intelligence failure, because the CIA and the intelligence community didn't describe and anticipate just how badly Russia would perform and how well Ukraine would resist. How do you get past that expectation, both in public and I think probably among policymakers, of that prediction equals intelligence?
So there is a very fine line between, taking the risk of predicting something and going the opposite way of saying nothing, because you're afraid of making a prediction that can be wrong. And then people read your things and say, well, you didn't really tell me anything. And one of the, I think, criticisms, that's been out in the press for, quite a while, is that a lot of what is written in the intelligence community doesn't come down hard enough on a prediction. And it's a too wishy-washy or whatever. I think that there is some merit to that that conclusion, that oftentimes our pieces get muddled a bit. They become least common denominator. And sometimes coordination in the intelligence community can lead to that, because everybody's trying to agree on a line. And if you can only get agreement on a line, it might be a kind of dumbed down line. And so I would really encourage people to not worry about dissents and to just put forth, stronger analytic points. But I would also say that, doing straight line predictions and saying, we think this is going to happen, should always be provided in some kind of context about what are the drivers or the variables that are leading you to that conclusion. How, if those change, could your conclusion be different? There has to be an exposure of why you think something in order to help the policymaker understand how you might be wrong and how much confidence they have in what you think, not just your own confidence, but how much confidence they have in your conclusions. And that's why after Iraq WMD, there was a lot of focus on transparency on how did the sausage get made. But I think that we have become a little bit too gun shy in some ways. I was maybe now's the time to kind of bring up this Iran example, Paul, but I was listening to the interview between the D&I Haynes and Andrea Mitchell coming out of the Reagan library conference that happened this past week. And it's so difficult when you're put in the circumstance of giving an interview or giving testimony or doing a briefing that people will tend to forget the nuance that you have in your answer. And what you will see broadcast is, the line maybe taken out of context, maybe cut back a little bit. This happened to me on COVID. What I told the president was completely taken out of context and unfairly so. But it is a difficult position that we're put in as intelligence agencies that sometimes people are going to say that you said something you didn't say. It's not always going to be fair because life isn't fair. But I also think we do need to be very, very cognizant of saying sentences that maybe imply something that we don't actually think. And I think that the quote that I saw in the newspapers about Director Haynes's interview was that the intelligence community was saying that there was no risk to the Iranian regime. And I don't think that's exactly what she said. And I also would say, gosh, if we are saying that, we need to be putting a lot of caveats in there because the variables of what's going on in Iran right now are significant. And something like the Supreme Leader's death tomorrow could throw our understanding of the current state of affairs completely on its head. I mean, it could totally upend where we think things are going. So, and I'm sure that the analysts are thinking those things through, but you got to make sure that those come out in the conversation. And sometimes it's hard when you're doing it in a public setting.
So we're into the 10th month of war in Ukraine. Intelligence community anticipated the war, didn't anticipate how it was going to go in early days, let alone up till now. If you're in the hot seat and are asked by a policymaker, by the president, by others, with the tasking of what's this going to look like next year? What is this when we're sitting here a year from now? What is going to happen? How do you approach that personally, and how do you bring it back analytically?
I think that in a case when you're looking so far ahead on something where you have a lot of different factors that can change, that you have to do a scenarios-based approach and be clear about what the drivers are of the different scenarios and, give your best case of what you think is the most likely scenario and why, but also play out how different variables can lead to different outcomes. So not only you are tracking it as an analyst, but that your key policymakers can track something that is absolutely important. You don't want to, you're not going to do this for every analytic issue, but when it comes to something as important as what's going to happen in the next year in the Russia invasion of Ukraine and the future of Russia and all that, you've got to have some scenarios built and some clarity. And you should be, I think, going back to those constantly and asking yourself, have these variables changed? Have the factors changed? Has our weight for the different factors changed and why? And I would definitely make sure that this is a interdisciplinary endeavor. And I would, as I mentioned before, bring in people who have seen, experienced different scenarios that might be similar in some ways from different areas or different eras to be challenging what you're saying and what you're thinking. But it's got to be a team sport. And I think that maybe one of the reasons, I don't really know, honestly, but I guess, let me just say a couple things about, why the analysis was wrong and I'm guessing here about how the invasion unfolded. If the Russians had been successful in taking out President Zelensky as they had planned, the agency might not have been wrong. And that was something that probably a lot of people were working to avoid. I'm guessing that there were, that might have been something that was very clear at the time to a lot of people, that was the goal. And there was a lot of work going on to prevent that goal from happening. So this is a case where, perhaps US or at least the Ukrainian efforts to avoid something that was telegraphed actually changed the outcome.
Yeah, that's a great, it's such a great dynamic there, because we think about, it's really easy to fall into, what's, history is being pre-written, right? There's a course that things are going to take, and the job of intelligence is to identify what that course is. But the job of policymakers, sometimes intelligence, but policymakers, is to shape what the future looks like, is to change the outcome. And by definition, the very intelligence that is used to the policymakers that drives a decision one way or another, put your thumb here, do this action, engage in this military activity or this covert action or whatever it is, will change history. And then intelligence change. So that dynamic of how you anticipate an environment that your partners and policymakers are trying to change, it's a bit of a dynamic there. And then you run the risk of, well, you got that wrong because your intelligence correct at the time, but enabled us to change the future, but you didn't predict that changed future.
Right, exactly. But I do think, I'm guessing also that one of the reasons that we got this wrong, so taking aside, what happened with the effort to take Zelensky out of the picture, I suspect that there wasn't as much multidisciplinary analysis about the factors that would affect the ability of the Russian military to carry out their plans. We're often not as good at the soft part of the equation, the sociological issues, the relationships between people. If you know that conscripts are tortured as a matter of practice in the Russian military, it tells you something about how the chain of command is going to go, especially if you don't have an NCO corps. And if you know the depth of corruption, then they might run out of fuel. But are you factoring that in? So people knew those things, but maybe it didn't get distilled in a way that allowed kind of building some scenarios about how it could go wrong for the Russians.
Yeah. Let's stay on Ukraine and Russia, and let's look ahead into 2023. So I've got my own sort of current views, and they're probably not far off mainstream of how things are going to go. But what I would argue is that almost for a certainty, there's going to be surprise. So I think conventional wisdom right now argues that, well, look, we're looking at a static war in the winter. We've probably reached firm lines. Russia's, ameliorated some of its early failures. They're putting in new men. They're trying to build equipment. They're systematically dismantling Ukrainian energy infrastructure. So it's looking like World War I, war of attrition, grinded out. I suspect the Ukrainians have more surprises up their sleeves, simply because they've continued to surprise throughout the course of the war, from the early days up through their offensives around Kharkiv, up through taking out the Kerch Straits Bridge, and now up to their attacks on Russian strategic assets deep inside Russian territory. Who would have predicted that, a year ago? So as you think about what surprises might be out there in this war, and it can be either in the conduct of the war, but also think about in terms of escalation risks, of spillover, of conflict, of knock-on effects, of political will in Europe, of sudden leadership change. All of these things are factors which will be interrelated and playing in. How are you thinking about this right now?
So I am in the state where I feel like it's really hard to predict. And I would not believe anybody who tells you how they think this is going to unfold, past a couple of months at a time, because there are so many factors. And I actually think that, kind of what I hear out of the intelligence community is it's probably pretty good on that, in saying like, well, the most likely case is stalemate, but, I also worry in some ways about the intelligence community telegraphing too much of what they think, because it could affect outcomes. Right. And every time I hear, some of my favorite outside, private sector commentators on this, dissecting the weaknesses of the Russians or whatever, I'm like, oh, should we be saying that? It might help them figure this out. Like, maybe we should shut up. But I do think that there is a potential there for much more rapid change than what we expect. A lot of this, to me, it plays out in the South. And some of this could be based on how do Russians who are living in Crimea right now react. I mean, you hear about people selling houses and leaving and feeling insecure. And if they do another attack on the Kerch Bridge, it's not completely back yet. Putin was just there, but I mean, you don't necessarily have to have Ukrainian troops on the ground in Crimea taking it over in order to threaten it to the point where everybody on the Russian side gets super scared. And I do think that the points of, what the intelligence community and the policymakers are concerned about is this moment when Russia panics, right? And that's where we were around Kherson, a month ago, fearing that, if those Russian troops got trapped and they took out a big chunk of Russian soldiers, what would that mean? Would that risk Russia taking steps to go nuclear or do some kind of provocation? So I guess, I don't rule out the idea that there could be another quick advance that surprises us, even though I don't think that that's likely. I think that the big wild card in many ways is Ukrainian politics. And, the Russians at some point might be ready to come to the negotiating table, but they're not going to be negotiating on terms that are okay for the Ukrainians. And the Ukrainians are, they're just not willing, despite all the energy getting taken out. I just don't think that they're willing right now to give up, given how much has been lost. And that is going to be, I think, the big wild card, whether you have, especially a European country, really getting fed up and saying, you guys have to go to the negotiating table. I don't think we're anywhere close to that right now, but I think we could get there at some point. And, maybe the Republican House will get there sooner too. Recent polling shows a bit of a weakening of indefinite U.S. support.
Well,
I don't
certainly
know.
with Putin, it certainly appears to me to be Putin's strategy to that. Look, stop the battlefield losses. Systematically work to undermine through the air campaign and campaign against civilian infrastructure, energy, water, heat, transport, etc., to undermine political will and political support within Ukraine, as well as to do the same with the West. And time's on their side, vice ours, in that respect, is how they calculate.
I think in some ways this campaign is, yes, it's about, trying to weaken resolve, trying to divide the West, actually trying to change the military calculus a little bit by having the Ukrainians shoot off a lot of their air defense. And, we're all struggling to find enough ammunition and air defense to send them. So you're also changing, some capabilities. But ultimately what I worry about is that it makes Ukraine such a broken nation that it actually allows Putin not to lose. Because ultimately, if Ukraine is so broken, and with that, after the war, whatever, or in some stalemate, political divisions will start coming out again. And it will be so broken that maybe it can never be a member of the West. And I think that's what Putin, may be driving at here. Is it, ultimately, if Ukraine can't be a member of the West because it is such a mess, maybe they haven't lost, even though they haven't won.
Yeah. The alternative narrative on that is that Russia is eliminating old Soviet era infrastructure that was never going to integrate very well or be very efficient. And now Ukraine has an opportunity to build back better once the
It does, but with
starts.
whose money?
Yeah. Well,
and
certainly it's got to be Western
money?
and American. Yeah.
Exactly. And, I think that how many, they're running out of just supplies to rebuild the energy infrastructure, for example. They're scouring the world to find the cables and the generators and all of that, because we don't have a lot of extra laying around. So yeah, I mean, I think that, the Ukrainians will survive this winter, but the long-term implications right now of what Ukraine looks like and how it will be managed by the West and the international community, those are big variables.
So before we move on from Ukraine, so what would you anticipate would be the core intelligence requirement being levied upon the IC from the president and from the Security Council right now?
Well, I mean, obviously, there's going to be a lot on the military balance of power. And just, I mean, how many times we've read that the Russians are running out of ammo? And they're not out of ammo yet. So maybe they're getting close, maybe they're not. But, to understand the real balance of forces is a key question. And then the other things are just, what is the will of the Russian people to continue to support this war? I mean, Russian mothers have been a key factor over time and in previous wars of bringing wars to an end. We haven't seen a ton of that, but we do have new polling out just this past week from Russia that shows, I think it was 40% of Russians want the war to end, want peace talks. Only 25% want the war to continue. That's a big weakening.
Yeah, that's significantly different than
if that polling turns out to be correct, which was supposedly internal Russian polling. So, I think that there is a weakening there over the winter, and it's something we don't think about. I mean, we worry a lot about Ukraine, but I think there's some complications there. More people probably fled Russia than were mobilized. There's all this conversation about a second round of mobilization. Really? I don't see it happening.
Yeah. It's having a huge impact on just businesses, trying to.
That's right. The human brain drain, it's just huge. So, I don't feel like I know enough right now to predict the future on what's going to happen. So I won't go there. I know this conversation is probably really unsatisfying to most people, but I think it kind of reveals the intelligence community knows a lot more than I do. And they are a lot more expert than I am. But I think that it reveals that it's kind of a fool's errand in some ways to just do a straight line prediction of what's going to happen, because this is a human endeavor, a lot of variables.
I mean, what I'm holding in my head that from what you're saying is that it's a fool's errand to try to predict the future, but it's absolutely essential to prepare for many futures.
Exactly. And to be continuously going through those and communicating change.
Yeah. So with that, then I've got a whole list of things I'm thinking about for 2023, because it seems like there's, more than there's every year there's always the, here's all the bad things that can happen and the nasty
We're good at
surprises.
doing the bad things.
but it seems like this year more than any, there's such a degree of volatility, such a degree of complexity, such a degree of things interrelated that often the ICs, they'll sort of parse out different geographies or different topics, but now they also interrelate. So you just think about legacy of COVID and continued COVID in parts of the world, particularly China. You think about the impact of things like inflation. You think about the tensions over Taiwan and Chinese domestic politics. You think, and I'm sure we'll talk about Iran at some point, of different pieces of domestic instability. And how are you looking at 2023, and what would you sort of suggest folks in business and government focus on first?
Well, there is a high degree of volatility. That's not going to change. And I don't think that, I think that people are sometimes too willing to grasp at straws and think like, oh, this is going to make things better. Oh, the Biden-Xi meeting means that things are going to be better. Or, oh, zero COVID's ending and now everything is going to be fine. And it's going to be bumpy no matter what, because the fundamentals right now of the world are such, I think that they're driven by multiple things that haven't ended. One is the Russia-Ukraine war continues to have global implications and fallout. There is no way to change that. There's no way to completely, end the inflation, to make food and fertilizer back where it was before. These things are just going to continue on. U.S.-China relations. We are currently in an economic war with China. We have declared war by an executive order on semiconductors. And I don't care if you think it's good or bad or whatever, it is. And it's not the last effort in order to try to constrain China's rise at the U.S. or Western expense. And, which is what this is focused on. It's like, you got to play fair, and unfair stuff we're going to call, and things that threaten national security we're going to call. But we're in a position right now where domestic politics is really adding a lot of fuel to this fire on anti-China actions. And, in the run up to 2024, it's also going to be a race on who's tougher on China. And that honestly worries me a little bit, because we have to be tough on China. No one's accused me of being a panda hugger, but I think that you've got to be smart about this. Decoupling is not possible, 100% decoupling. We've got to improve our supply chain resilience, blah, 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 right? All those things we have to do. But like, every idea about knocking China down isn't a good idea. We just have to be smart about what we're doing, because we can get into this death spiral with China in a way that is just very, very unhelpful. And I worry that politics sometimes drives us, domestic politics drives us to those places. So that kind of US-China dimension affects so much in the world in terms of what countries do and what nations do. And I could not agree more that, I don't know if it's the world is flat, or the jigsaw puzzles is changing, or, the Zeitenwende, as the Germans call it, the tectonic shift that's going on in this world. We have not seen an end to that. But we are definitely seeing trends out of it, and how we react to those trends as a country is really important. And not overreacting to how countries behave, not thinking of everything in a zero sum of, you do this one thing, that means you're anti-US or with, pro-US. Maybe it's just that their countries are doing their own policies of X country first, just like Americans do that. So I think that it just takes there's a lot of complexity here. I would say that there's some real positive things going on in terms of.
Please
Yeah, no, I mean,
I think
everybody's
everyone
very,
needs to hear that.
I think a lot of us are very Europe focused, and I would like to draw people's attention to Asia and to really think about the changes going on in the fantastic alliances we have right now in Asia. I mean, we have an incredible relationship with Japan and a really good relationship with South Korea, a fantastic relationship with Australia. We have things going on in our alliance system that is unprecedented. We had all of those countries and more from Asia showing up at the NATO summit in Madrid. Japan and South Korea now have offices opened up in NATO. There's discussion about how to include Japan more in the AUKUS alliance. Maybe not a full up, JAUKUS or whatever you want to call it, but maybe incorporating Japan a little bit more into that. We have the Quad, even though there are some real reasons of concern about what India's policy is, there's a lot of strength in that relationship as it relates to China. And so, I would say that alliances are so important. And we are in a great period of alliances right now. And we've got to put our policies in place in a way that supports those alliances, even at the cost of some other policies, because this is what's going to save us. It's what differentiates us from China and Russia and Iran and North Korea and Venezuela, and go down the list of our adversaries. And it is, it is the thing that makes us different and good, right? So I think our success really lies in that. And we're just not our trade policy. We don't have a trade policy. There's a lot of things here that I wish we would really put our alliances. This administration has, but I would like to see more. It's because it's the shining good spot.
I mean, you mentioned the complexity of how issues get single thread in terms of how we look at different countries, and India is a great example of that, right? So there's been great consternation about knockdown prices. They're pursuing their own economic interest in that, and one could argue that, well, since they're buying it at prices at about the cap, that okay, it's pretty much what we're aiming for. But even if it was seen as sort of running contrary to our Ukraine policy, we have such deep long-term strategic interests in that relationship and how it fits into the rest of the Indo-Pacific.
Yes, I mean, Turkey is another example where there is an importance to these relationships with countries where we don't always see eye to eye, and I think that there are sometimes problems with how we frame arguments about why we're doing things. When we have a values-based foreign policy, which I definitely believe in, it does cause problems sometimes when we're dealing with countries that have slightly different values. And so, I do think that we need to be able to shape our messages in ways that can work through these things. And I've seen the Biden administration, I think, really shifting and adapting their messaging to reflect this reality. And so I think that is good. I mean, we all need to be part of learning organizations and seeing how things go. But India is not going to be any different today versus tomorrow in terms of its foreign policy approach. It's incredibly consistent. And people who think that it's going to be different because we have shared concerns, it will be deep in some places and it will be problematic in other places, and it will always be that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you mentioned, we'll pivot to questions here in just a second. Maria, we'll start teeing them up, questions from the audience. But one last one before we do that, Beth. So you touched on how domestic politics impacts foreign relations. China as an example of that. Intelligence community is assiduously does not report on and analyze domestic politics. But as you noted, it has enormous impact on the policies, activities, behaviors of other nations. How do you fit that? How do you approach that as an IC when you say particular Chinese activities and behaviors vis-a-vis Taiwan are going to be affected by U.S. domestic politics? How do you weave that together, or walk that line?
So people are I would say, at different places on the spectrum on this issue. I mean, you have analytic leaders and former leaders who say, like, well, you should just never go there. I personally think that you need to understand U.S. policy and understand it deeply in order to be helpful. And if you don't understand where we're going or what we're saying, then you can't explain how a country is reacting or likely to react. And so, it's a pretty complicated space. You can't put those things on paper, and, I wouldn't want people to put things on paper like that, but you do need to understand that, well, this administration might be more willing to do X, Y, or Z, or, some senior official has done a speech and it says this. You should be reading those speeches and understanding that and looking at the commentary from whatever you're following to see what the reaction is. So, I think that you can't live in an ivory tower, and having a conversation, having relationships with policymakers is just essential to understanding how the intelligence community can support what their goals are, whether you personally agree with those goals or not. It's the intelligence community's role and responsibility to support policymaking and not to have that judgment. So today I've given you like my personal opinion on things and on policies, right? But, when I was in the intel community, I was assiduously working, never to say those things, and really trying not even to think those things, right? Not my job.
Okay, great. Maria, let's go to questions from our studio audience.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you both for a fascinating conversation so far. We've had a lot of questions coming in, testament to how thought-provoking that this discussion has been so far. We have a few different types of questions coming in. One category is on specific geopolitical questions. So Beth, wanting your thoughts both on the here and now and also looking ahead. And then the other type of questions has to do with intelligence tradecraft and the art and science of intelligence. So we'll do our best to address both of those categories. One subtopic that's come up in the Q&A is black swans or unexpected events. So we have two questions that I'll throw to you at the same time to do with what you will. The first is, unforeseen events have the potential to upend the world in unexpected ways. This is not an easy question, but is there anything far outside the box that you've been looking at that's been on your radar over the past few months or even the past 1 to 2 years that you would keep an eye on? So that's one. What unexpected events are you thinking about as potential? And then the second one is a question we're asking if there's a danger in the IC risking almost organizational pathology in being preoccupied with black swans or unexpected events, which are by definition unpredictable. Where's the balance between healthy vigilance and being reactive to surprises?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty hard to actually list black swans because then they wouldn't really be black swans. It's more of the, gray mallards or something that are, easier for us to identify and talk about. So I think that the questioner actually gets to a good point that, the world is very unpredictable. What you can do is talk about, how stable and how resilient are different systems, countries, organizations to withstanding shock, because shock is going to happen in unpredictable ways. I mean, you look at Pakistan, one of the things we didn't talk about was climate change. and how you can have like massive, a third of the country underwater, and how that plays into a lot of other things that are going on, right? We could easily see something else happening in China. So for now, these protests seem like they're kind of put in a box, but couldn't something else happen, like the fire in Urumqi and how that set off these protests? You can't predict that fire, and you can't predict that particular Tunisian vegetable seller self-emulating, or whatever the word is. Sorry, I'm so tired. So I don't know about those things, but one of the things I am, I do feel like we're very preoccupied, and for good reason, in both the great power competition with China and what's going on with the Russia-Ukraine war. But I continue to be very worried about the Middle East and instability there. I'm perpetually worried about Egypt, which I think is a very fragile place. Now they're just getting an IMF loan that should come through in the next few weeks. And so that probably, kicks the can down the road. But look at Iran, look at Israel politics right now and who is in the government in this next Israeli government. And I think you have quite a potential there for the kind of shadow war between Israel and Iran to really erupt into something very, very major. And you can see Iran striking out in terms of its regional aggression in ways that provoke all of us and lead to that escalation. So, I am very worried about some of the unpredictable things that can happen there. Just this last night, we had an Iranian ship intersect with an American ship, try to blind the bridge with floodlights, got within dangerous distance, and luckily the professionalism and expertise of the U.S. sailors diffuse that event. But I can definitely see another Strait of Hormuz type problem, and the Iranians are going to be enriching like crazy in the next few months. What are we going to do about this? So I know the administration is thinking about this, so I'm not saying they're not, absolutely. But I'm not sure the American people are ready for another crisis. And North Korea, you've got to put this back also on the radar. North Korea, absolutely a huge problem. And we're getting no help from the Russians and the Chinese on that one.
Thank you so much, Beth, for going through all of that. And particularly for mentioning Korea at the end, or North Korea, pardon me, at the end, which was another question.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many you could throw out there. What about Turkey and Greece? I mean, who's paying attention to the fact that Turkey and Greece right now are in a horrible state? And with the run up to the Turkish elections, you can see Erdogan doing all sorts of things, going back into Syria as he's threatening, doing something with one of the islands, a lot of naval activity, a lot of potential for miscalculation. We could be completely surprised by an inter-NATO conflict.
And you start adding in Eastern Med energy development and
right.
the Turkish efforts to interrupt Cypriot exploration.
Yes.
French Navy sending warships to warn off Turkey, extraordinarily volatile. And I think the energy mix now, particularly given the search for alternative supply with the fundamental transition, I think that's another piece that's going to be really hard for us to understand. That the decoupling of European energy, which was based on 50 years of economic policy, is going to be extraordinarily disruptive, I think.
Extraordinarily. And again, adding climate change right now, there's not a lot of wind in Europe, and it has an impact. And rivers are down. Yeah. So,
but there's a good supply of gas bags.
Yeah, there are.
Well, thank you both very much. We have many more questions coming in, and some of them have to do with how we take the lessons from Russia and Ukraine so far, and then apply them looking ahead. So in terms of Russia and Ukraine, we have a question of whether the IC has internalized lessons from overestimating Russia's military, which Beth, you mentioned earlier, when assessing the PRC's military capabilities, and what can or should be done in terms of learning lessons from the Russian case for avoiding over or underestimating military capabilities in other cases such as China.
I don't know because I'm not there, but I also think a lot of the military analysts who were working Russia. I know many of them personally, and they are top notch. And so, you know, I absolutely think that the intelligence community, there's so many smart people there that they've got to be learning from this. At the same time, I would say that there is not enough of a challenge culture inside the intelligence community. And I would like to see more openness with people, with analysts accepting and thinking about how they could be wrong in a way that is non-threatening. Which is why I like the crowdsourced forecasting, because I think it's just, you know, it isn't a person saying that you're wrong. It's just a group of people, and this is what came out of it in aggregate, and you can take it or leave it, but it should be stimulating thinking. So I would like to have more formal lessons learned where it doesn't feel like gotcha and it becomes more part of the culture. So it's not painful, it's just normal.
Can you give a sorry, Maria.
Sorry, Paul, I was going to say that was another question. We had somebody asking how to improve the ability to challenge conventional wisdom and paradigms within the IC. Thank you.
Beth, can you give an example on the crowdsourcing side? You know, if you have one on looking ahead at 2023 or farther ahead of you know what that looks like, or maybe something that you saw that you were surprised by.
So I think that the way that forecasting should be used by analysts isn't to provide an answer to them, but it is to say, okay, here's this forecast. Number one, let's have everybody look at this. Do you agree with this percentage? Are you over, under, and why do you have, you know, force analysts to actually come up with a numerical probabilistic forecast? Not that you would necessarily write it down, but come up with it and defend it and say why you think it, and then compare. This is part of like putting rigor into the process, because it's too easy to say, you know, well, I think this is going to happen. And there's definitely rigor behind it and why. But I think that we could put more into the system by having built-in challenges that are based on probabilistic forecasts throughout the process. It also just helps sharpen your ability to ask good questions. Are we asking the right questions? Are they questions that can be answered? Or do you have to break it down into the factors that underlie that overarching question? There's a lot there.
Maria, over to you.
Thank you. We have a lot of questions still coming in. Some of them are more policy prescriptive questions, so I will focus mostly on the intelligence ones and the Tradecraft ones, unless, Beth, you do want to enjoy being out of the IC.
It depends. It's easier sometimes not to have to pick.
We do have some questions. Okay, so I'll go with some of the Tradecraft questions. One is regarding the focus on foreign malign influence, which we know is a focus within the IC. The questioner is asking about the seeming trend to focus increasingly on foreign malign influence, and whether this is part of the whether we're likely to see more of this in an effort within the IC to use tools to influence adversaries at tactical, operational, or strategic levels to counter foreign malign influence.
I really don't think I can answer that question. It's a real policy question. It's not an intel question about whether there should be some kind of activity designed to influence operations. That's a policy question, and the intelligence community, is simply told to act or not act.
To start to pull us back from the policy to the intelligence side, a questioner is asking about whether there's room within the agency. You've partially addressed this, but for internal expressions of policy dissenting views, or is that really just not within scope of what analysts are doing?
Well, I don't think that analysts should be expressing views about policy. I don't think that analysts should be expressing views about politics. And, one of my concerns is that with the polarization of America, that you have polarization and somewhat inside every government organization, right? And I kind of yearn for those days when I started where you never knew what political orientation, if there was any, of the person sitting next to you. And, I was talking to an old friend of mine recently, and he said, yeah, I went to a barbecue and I worked with this guy for 30 years. And I found out last week he's a Republican. I never knew that. And that's how it should be, because we really shouldn't, there's a role for leadership to have a political orientation that, if they're selected to be that. But I really think that the apolitical nature of the intelligence community is something that we need to reinforce right now. And if anybody asks me, they say, oh, I'd love to join the intel community, or I want to be on a political campaign. I'm like, well, you don't belong in the intel community then, because that's not who we are.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions coming in about interdisciplinarity within intelligence analysis and trying to understand, especially with the interconnectivity of issues, some of which have come up in this call. Some could be, say, when you have technological challenges intersecting with geopolitical challenges. So
yeah.
The question is to do with whether this is happening or should be happening on the analytical side, whether you need interdisciplinary teams or interdisciplinary individuals who are focusing on these challenges. Is this something that you see as an increasing focus, or is this something that has always been the case in the IC?
I think that, obviously there are interdisciplinary teams, there are interagency teams. One of the great strengths of the intelligence community and of the National Intelligence Council at ODNI is the ability to bring teams together from across agencies and across disciplines at a moment's notice to consider what's happening. And we see this happening, and has been happening for many years. I do think, though, that, we are in a place in our world where I call it kind of the Twitter effect, where everybody is thinking more narrowly. I call it thinking small. And it relates to, the fact that our kids are told to specialize in sports, when they're in third grade. You can't play all the sports. You got to focus on this. And so we tend to really become experts at things. And I think that there's a really important role for there to be people who are thinking big, who think strategically, who think beyond the box that they were given, and read widely, have friends of all different persuasions, are just, thinking very big about the world and its connectivity. And those people are becoming more and more rare. So you need both. You need the deep, deep experts, but you also need people who say like, yeah, but I was reading about something that happened over here. And it's so interesting. It reminded me about what we're looking at in our country or in this situation or on this technology. So I think we need to see a lot more of that. And we also need to see a lot more of the intersection of the open source world of, thought leaders and data providers who are outside the intelligence community being more integrated and having analysts exposed to that. Everybody believes in that. So this isn't like news, but there's only so many hours in the day. And so figuring out how those things can be incorporated is a continuous challenge.
That tees up very nicely the next question I was going to raise, which is on your perspective on open source in terms of the value of open source versus classified. We've seen, especially with Ukraine, with the work by Bellingcat and others, the tremendous power of what can be harnessed through pure open source. Where do you see us in 2022, heading into 2023, in terms of the value of open source versus classified, as opposed to previous decades when we didn't have these tools available?
I mean, I think that there's still cultural barriers, especially, probably especially at CIA, that, need to be broken down a little bit about some of the value of open source. But at the same time, it is the combination of open source with clandestine that often produces the best outcomes. And so I don't really think of it as one or the other. I think of it as, how can you harness open source in a way that supports and builds on the other secret information that you have? And, so I would love to see, more open source integration in a, kind of in a collector expertise sense, to figure out, like, you have to have cultural knowledge and not just open source knowledge to do this well. I mean, so Paul and I, look at Bellingcat, for example, and one of the things that makes Bellingcat so great is because they have people who work there who know where the sources of data in Russia are. They know that you can buy on the dark web the entire, Moscow DMV. But if you're in the Philippines, maybe you can't do that. But there's some other source of information that has all that data. And that's the kind of expertise that I think really needs to be built up. It is, a deep understanding of the place and where to find the data, both that is particular to that place, and then also, in a more generic sense outside, that are, global sources of data or business sources of data. And there's definite progress being made by some of our friends here and other fellows like Kristen Wood. Plug for Kristen Wood.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for that. And we can also plug a webinar that Kristen ran with several open source.
Yes, it was really good.
November 2nd. It's now viewable through the Belfer Center's YouTube channel.
Yeah, people should watch that. It's great.
Well, thank you very much for that plug. It was very good content. So just in the last few minutes, shifting back to geopolitical, what we can learn from 2022 to focus on 2023. We have some questions coming in terms of the complexity of the international environment and the necessity to work with Russia on certain issues, despite the war in Ukraine. And this actually could tie into what you alluded to with the Middle East, of watching what's going on in the Middle East. We've seen historically the US and Russia being at odds in some cases, but also needing to work together and cooperate.
Yeah.
In other cases. So we have a question about your views on how the West moves forward with relations with Russia on arms control or engagement across many issues when we've seen Russia's willingness to violate some of those concerns. Yeah, and then also a question about strategic deterrence between Russia and NATO, what we've learned from the past year that could apply going forward.
Well, first I would say that we should be thinking ahead with China and not allowing ourselves to get as much as, it takes two to tango, right? So we can want as much as we want, as to have this dialogue with Russia, but they're the ones that just canceled the New START discussions. So, there's a part of the equation that you don't have any control over. And I would say that, one of the most important things that came out of the G. Biden meeting is setting up basis for dialogue continuing among different cabinet members with their Chinese counterparts, even though she is ultimately the decider. And I don't know how useful in some ways these things are, but we have to have the ability to have dialogue, even with countries with whom we greatly disagree with, when they are important in terms of our national security and global security. So with Russia, I don't know the answer to this because, right now they are not able and we are not able, but we should be planning for restarting these conversations at an expert level or at a 2.0 track, meaning experts who are out of government, to be maintaining dialogue, because we absolutely need to have dialogue in order to avoid strategic disaster, as unpleasant as that is.
Thank you. I think that's a good note to close out on. It's somewhat alarming, but also somewhat optimistic in terms of what the path forward could be. Paul, back over to you.
Thanks, Maria. So I'm going to put you on the spot. Actually, I'm going to put both of you on the spot with a lightning round question of, and I'll jump in after I hear your answers. I'll jump in as well. What are the three biggest surprises that we would look back a year from now and say, wow, I didn't expect that?
Oh, that's really unfair. You did not prepare me for any of these questions. Well, that isn't fair. I have no idea. Looking ahead, oh gosh. I guess we could see some positives, I think, in alliance integration. I also think that we might be surprised in some ways by the Chinese charm offensive going on, because they are really working hard to bypass some of the constraints that we're placing on them. Their outreach to Australia and other things. But ultimately, I don't know, Paul. I'm not feeling. I think that there will be shocks to the system, but I think that a year from now, maybe it won't look that different.
Thank you for going first, Beth. And
I did a horrible job, and I want to hit erase. And an hour from now, I'm going to be kicking myself and saying, why didn't I say X, Y, and Z? It's so obvious.
And then we'll hold another pop-up webinar to address the question.
You get a mulligan, yeah. Okay, over to you,
I
Maria.
need a mulligan.
I will take the route of focusing on categories and hope that will satisfy the question. One, which is somewhat piggybacking off what Beth said, is on the diplomacy side. I think we've seen the Abraham Accords, we've seen other developments that were more promising than we would have anticipated in terms of countries that weren't working together now working together. So my more aspirational, optimistic one is that we'll see a bit of that. In terms of shocks to the system, I think it's important to be watching multinational corporations and the eroding trust in institutions, but trust in companies that we've seen in some cases where employees, according to surveys, trust their companies more than their countries, more than their governments. But with recent mass layoffs and tech upheaval and some corporations potentially spying on employees, and we're seeing some real ups and downs in that as well. So I'm not going to predict the industry or the company, but I worry that we're going to see some sort of upheaval with that, with the economic situation. And then the third one is, maybe this isn't in the spirit of your question, Paul, it's not unexpected, but we haven't seen the end of the ups and downs of the pandemic and of easing and then tightening of restrictions. And as we've seen in China, that can be quite intertwined with political unrest. So I would be keeping an eye on that with COVID or with another pandemic type scenario we haven't seen yet.
Yeah, I'm going to add to that, Maria, because, like thinking about where China is, I'm a bit of a China bear where, I as I mentioned in the beginning, I think people are kind of grasping onto straws and saying it's going to be better, it's going to be better. At the beginning of this year, when there were forecasts of GDP in China at like 5.5%, right? And I kept saying, no, it's going to be lower, it's going to be lower. And sure enough, over the entire year, it's been ticking down, 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 down. And now all the financial people are saying like, we'll be back in the second quarter. I don't think it will be. And I think that we're going to be shifting in some ways from China being all powerful to China worrying about China in weakness. And, and that is going to be a whole different paradigm for us to think through. It doesn't mean that they're not a challenge to us still, but I think that we might be going through a period because the fundamentals in China are not good. From 20% unemployment, youth unemployment, the social contract being broken, I think, and not being really put back together again. Just because people aren't on the street doesn't mean that they're happy. They're not happy. And they feel like they weren't treated as human beings. They're not going to be able to repair that. Property sector still broken, COVID up and down, Apple, saying, gosh, we've got to move because instability here, we can't trust it. So we're going to be seeing more, partial decoupling, plus you add on the technology, and then you're going to see more spying, more cyber in order to get the technology that we've cut them off on. I think we're going to be seeing a much, a China that's acting out of weakness instead of a China that is acting out of strength. So I guess that would be my big thing for the year. I needed like 5 seconds to think. You're so
I think you took your mulligan and used it to nail a 300-yard drive right down the middle of the fairway. I think that's a great answer, and it's a really interesting issue. If we think that dealing with an ascendant China is difficult and problematic, dealing with a internally weak and struggling China with domestic issues poses such an array of potential risks. And the only analogy I would use is, Russia, I think attacked Ukraine out of fundamental weakness, internal weakness, and a desire to bolster internal strength and legitimacy and legacy. And when you start combining those issues of authoritarian leaders worried about their legacy, struggling with domestic issues of demographics and economy and perception and of status, that can lead to really reckless outcomes and behaviors.
Right, and you add Iran to that list. Same exact thing.
Add Iran to that list, and so I think you've got a trifecta of potential. I think that the theme of domestic instability and the changing of that paradigm, which we saw so recently of and Russia talked about it, and believed it. The West is in terminal economic, political, moral, spiritual decline, and we're on the rise. Well, I think the fallacy in that is really becoming clear, and I think what we'll see this year is a real reinforcement of that, and a shift of that sort of perception dynamic.
Yeah. And if people didn't hear us say climate change, let's say it one more time, because we're going to see more shocks, unexpected shocks out of climate change.
Beth, thank you so much. Great discussion. Fascinating. Wonderful to have you both here virtually, but so happy that you're visiting and talking with students and fellows, et cetera, today. Maria, thank you so much for such a great job moderating and fielding the questions. You do a terrific job of melding them together. Thank you so much. And
Thank you.
Happy holidays, everybody. Take care.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Beth. Thank you all for joining. Happy holidays.